Hey guys, tonight we venture into the frozen heart of one of history's most chilling mysteries. Picture this: an entire civilization thriving for nearly 5 centuries on the edge of the known world, suddenly vanishing without a trace. No final letters, no desperate pleas for help, no bodies left behind, just empty farms, abandoned churches, and the howling Arctic wind sweeping through ghost towns carved from ice and stone. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab something warm to drink, and let's step into the frozen wasteland where an entire people simply disappeared. You're about to discover what happened to the lost Vikings of Greenland, and trust me, the truth is stranger and more terrifying than any saga ever written. The year is 1721. Hans Egede, a Danish missionary, steps onto the icy shores of Greenland with dreams of converting the Norse Christians he expects to find there. He's heard the stories, read the records. For nearly 500 years, Vikings have called this frozen land home. Surely they're still here, still clinging to their ancient faith, still surviving in their stone churches and turf houses. But what Egede finds instead stops him cold. Empty ruins, crumbling walls, churches with no congregations, farms with no farmers. The silence is absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through abandoned doorways. The Vikings of Greenland haven't just left. They've vanished so completely, it's as if they never existed at all. This is where our mystery begins. An entire civilization wiped from the face of the earth with barely a whisper left behind. The story starts centuries earlier with a man whose temper burned as red as his hair. Erik Thorvaldsen, better known as Erik the Red, was exactly the kind of Viking you'd expect from the sagas. Hot-headed, violent, and absolutely unwilling to back down from a fight. His red hair and beard matched his explosive personality perfectly, earning him enemies wherever he went. First, Norway kicked him out for killing a man in a feud. So Erik packed up his family and sailed to Iceland, thinking he'd found a new start. But Erik's temper followed him across the sea. Soon enough, he was feuding with his Icelandic neighbors too, and when bodies started piling up, the local assembly had seen enough. They banished Erik from Iceland as well, giving him 3 years to find somewhere else to cause trouble. Now, most men might have taken this as a sign to calm down, maybe reflect on their choices. But Erik the Red wasn't most men. He was a Viking, and Vikings don't give up. They find new worlds to conquer. Erik had heard whispers of land to the west. Sailors spoke of glimpsing mountains through the fog, of coastlines that appeared and vanished like mirages. It was dangerous water out there, filled with ice and storms that could crush a ship like an eggshell. But for a man with nowhere else to go, danger was just another word for opportunity. In the year 982, Erik the Red loaded his ship with supplies and sailed west into the unknown. What he found there would change history forever. The land that greeted Erik was harsh beyond imagination. Glaciers stretched like frozen rivers between towering mountains. The coast was a maze of fjords, cutting deep into the ice. Winter here didn't just arrive, it conquered, turning the sea itself into a solid mass that could trap ships for months. But Eric saw something else. In the brief Arctic summer, he spotted patches of green in the valleys, grass that could feed livestock, rivers running free of ice. It wasn't much, but for a Viking who'd been kicked out of 2 countries, it was paradise. Here's where Eric's genius shows. He could have called this new land anything: Iceland, frozen hell, death's doorstep. Instead, he chose a name that would echo through history: Greenland. It was marketing genius 500 years before marketing was invented. Eric knew that if he wanted settlers to follow him into this frozen wasteland, he needed to make it sound appealing. So he painted word pictures of green valleys and rich pastures, of a land where a man could build a new life free from the feuds and politics of the old world. The name stuck, and it worked. When Eric's 3 years of banishment ended, he didn't return to Iceland with its tail between his legs. He came back as a conqueror, ready to lead others to the promised land he'd discovered. Picture the scene in Iceland when Eric returned. Word spreads through the settlements like wildfire. Eric the Red, the troublemaker who'd been banished in disgrace, has found a new world. Not just any world, but Greenland, a place where the grass grows green and the opportunities are endless. For many Icelanders, Eric's timing couldn't have been better. Iceland was becoming crowded. Good land was scarce, and political tensions were rising. The idea of starting fresh in a new land, away from old enemies and ancient grudges, appealed to adventurous souls and desperate families alike. In 985, Eric assembled his fleet. 25 ships loaded with everything needed to build a civilization from scratch. Men, women, children, livestock, tools, weapons, and dreams of a better life. Nearly 500 people ready to risk everything on Eric's promise of green fields in the frozen north. The voyage was a nightmare. The North Atlantic showed no mercy to Eric's colonists. Storms scattered the fleet like leaves in a hurricane. Ice floes crushed hulls and sent ships to the bottom with all hands aboard. By the time the survivors reached Greenland shores, only 14 ships remained. 11 vessels and hundreds of souls had been swallowed by the hungry sea, but those who survived were Vikings. They'd crossed the most dangerous waters on Earth to reach this frozen promised land, and they weren't about to give up now. Eric established his capital at Brattahlid, near what we now call Narsarsuaq. He built it in the heart of what would become known as the Eastern Settlement, claiming the title of paramount chieftain of all Greenland. Around him, the other survivors spread out along the fjords, marking out farms and building the turf houses that would shelter them through the brutal Arctic winters. The settlement grew. More ships arrived from Iceland and Norway, bringing fresh settlers eager to claim their piece of the new world. At its height, the Eastern Settlement housed somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people, spread across 500 farms scattered along the ice-carved coastline. But the Eastern Settlement wasn't alone. The Vikings established 2 more colonies in Greenland's habitable zones. The Western Settlement, despite its name, actually lay north of the main colony, tucked into the fjords near what is now Nuuk. Smaller than its eastern cousin, It still managed to support around 500 hardy souls. Then there was the middle settlement, the smallest of the three, clustered around what we now call Ivitut. Together, these three settlements represented one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Here, on the very edge of the inhabitable world, Vikings had built a functioning civilization. They raised cattle and sheep in the brief Arctic summers. They hunted seals and walruses in the icy waters. They even built churches, bringing Christianity to this frozen frontier. For nearly 5 centuries, the Norse Greenlanders thrived. They sent walrus ivory back to Europe, traded with passing ships, and maintained contact with the homeland across the storm-tossed sea. Archaeological evidence shows us a people who adapted to their harsh environment while maintaining their Viking identity. They were farmers and hunters, Christians and adventurers, living proof that human determination could overcome even the most hostile conditions. The ruins they left behind paint a picture of a complex society. Over 600 farms have been identified by archaeologists, along with churches, monasteries, and even what appears to be a small cathedral. These weren't temporary camps or desperate survival shelters. They were the foundations of a permanent civilization, built to last for generations, and for a time it seemed they would last forever. The Vikings of Greenland weren't just surviving in their ice-bound colonies, they were prospering. They sent expeditions even further west, discovering what we now know as North America 500 years before Columbus. Leif Erikson, Eric the Red Sun, established settlements in Finland, proving that Viking ambition knew no bounds. But prosperity in the Arctic is always fragile. The same ice that protected Greenland's fjords from Atlantic storms could also trap ships for months. The brief summers that allowed grass to grow could turn into endless winters that killed livestock and starved families. And the isolation that had once seemed like freedom would eventually become a prison. By the 13th century, cracks were beginning to show in the Norse Greenlandic dream. Climate patterns were shifting. The medieval warm period that had made Eric's original settlement possible was coming to an end. The Little Ice Age was beginning, bringing with it challenges that would test Viking resilience to its very limits. The seas grew stormier and more dangerous. Ice lingered longer in the fjords, cutting off trade routes and trapping hunting parties. The grass that had once grown green in Greenland's valleys struggled to survive in the cooling climate. Livestock that had thrived for centuries began to die in larger numbers each winter. But the Norse Greenlanders were Vikings. They'd survived the journey across the North Atlantic. They'd carved a civilization from ice and stone. They'd endured nearly 3 centuries of Arctic winters and emerged stronger. Surely they could adapt to whatever challenges lay ahead. They couldn't have known they were living through the beginning of the end, that within another 2 centuries their civilization would vanish so completely that future generations would wonder if they'd ever existed at all. The mystery of the lost Vikings was about to begin, and the answers would prove more elusive than the aurora dancing across Greenland's endless winter nights. The changes came slowly at first, like shadows lengthening at the end of a long Arctic day. The Norse Greenlanders had grown accustomed to hardship. It was part of their identity. woven into their very DNA like the intricate patterns on their carved ivory combs. But what they faced in the 14th and 15th centuries wasn't just hardship. It was transformation on a scale that would have broken lesser peoples. Picture a Viking farmer standing in his field in the year 1350, watching his cattle grow thin despite the summer grass. The growing season, once reliable as the sunrise, had begun to shrink. Where his grandfather might have counted on 4 months of green growth, he was lucky to get 3. The permafrost that had once retreated politely each spring now lingered like an unwelcome guest, keeping the soil frozen well into what should have been planting season. The ice told its own story. Hunters returning from the outer fjords spoke in hushed tones of ice that refused to break up, of seals forced to seek breathing holes farther and farther from shore. The walrus herds, once so abundant that ivory had made Greenland wealthy, began to disappear from their traditional hunting grounds. Where massive tusked bulls had once basked on ice floes, there was now only empty ocean or impenetrable sheets of ice. But here's what makes the Viking story so fascinating. They didn't just sit there and accept defeat. These were the descendants of Eric the Red, men and women who had crossed the most dangerous waters on earth to build something from nothing. They adapted, they evolved, they changed their entire way of life to match their changing world. Archaeological evidence reveals a stunning transformation in Norse Greenlandic society. The farmers who had once focused on cattle and sheep began to look toward the sea with new eyes. Excavations of garbage heaps from this period tell a remarkable story. In the early centuries, the majority of bones found are from domestic animals. Cows, sheep, goats, the foundation of any self-respecting Viking farm. But as the climate cooled and the ice advanced, those domestic animal bones become rarer and rarer. In their place, archaeologists find something else entirely. Seal bones. Thousands upon thousands of seal bones, along with the remains of seabirds, fish, and even whales. By the 14th century, some estimates suggest that seafood made up 80% of the Norse Greenlandic diet. Think about what this means. An entire civilization, built on the foundation of European farming traditions, reinvented itself as a maritime hunting culture. Viking farmers became Viking seal hunters, trading their plows for harpoons and their pastures for ice floes. It was adaptation on an epic scale, the kind of cultural flexibility that takes generations to develop. The transformation went deeper than just food. The very structure of Norse Greenlandic society began to shift. The old system, where wealth was measured in cattle and land ownership determined status, gave way to something entirely new. Now, the most successful men weren't necessarily the ones with the biggest farms. They were the ones who could lead hunting expeditions into the dangerous waters beyond the fjords, who could navigate through ice fields that would crush lesser sailors, who could bring back the walrus ivory that Europe still craved. This ivory trade became the lifeline that connected Greenland to the wider world. While the settlement struggled with cooling climate and failing crops, they still possessed something that European craftsmen desperately wanted. Walrus tusks, harder and whiter than elephant ivory, perfect for carving into chess pieces, religious artifacts, and decorative objects that adorned the halls of kings and bishops. The trade was incredibly lucrative. A single shipment of walrus tusks could be worth the equivalent of hundreds of cattle or tons of dried fish. In 1327, records show that an 800-kilogram parcel of Greenlandic ivory was worth a small fortune, enough to make any trader wealthy, beyond his wildest dreams. This wasn't just survival economics. This was big business, medieval style. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The very success of the walrus ivory trade may have contained the seeds of Greenland's eventual doom. The hunting required to maintain this trade was dangerous beyond imagination. Teams of Norse hunters would venture out onto the pack ice in small boats, traveling hundreds of miles north to reach the walrus colonies. They'd spend weeks or even months in conditions that would kill most people within hours. The risks were enormous. Ships could be crushed by shifting ice. Hunters could be separated from their vessels by sudden storms. Entire expeditions could vanish without a trace, swallowed by the hungry Arctic Ocean. And as the Little Ice Age tightened its grip, these dangers only multiplied. The ice became more unpredictable, the storms more violent, the hunting grounds more remote and difficult to reach. Yet the Norse Greenlanders kept going. They had to. The ivory trade wasn't just their connection to European luxury markets. It was their connection to survival itself. The ships that carried walrus tusks to Bergen and Trondheim returned laden with iron tools, weapons, grain, and all the manufactured goods that Greenland couldn't produce for itself. Cut off from this trade, the settlements would face slow starvation. The isolation was becoming more profound with each passing decade. The last recorded merchant ship from Norway reached Greenland in 1406, carrying a captain named Thorstein Olafsson. He stayed for several years, even marrying a local woman named Sigridda Bjarnardottir in 1408. Their wedding, documented by scribes in the church at Falsey, represent the last written record we have of Norse Greenlandic life. After that, silence. Complete, absolute silence. No more ships arrived from Norway. No more letters made their way back to Iceland. No more records were kept of births, deaths, or marriages. It was as if an entire civilization had simply decided to stop existing, at least as far as the rest of the world was concerned. But what was really happening in those final decades? Archaeological evidence suggests the truth was far more complex than simple abandonment. The Norse Greenlanders were still there, still struggling, still adapting to their changing world. But they were doing it in complete isolation, cut off from the European world that had once sustained them. The cooling climate had made the sea routes between Greenland and Norway increasingly dangerous. Ships that might have completed the journey safely in earlier centuries now faced ice-choked waters and violent storms that could last for weeks. The risk-reward calculation that had once favored regular trade voyages was shifting dramatically against the merchants and sea captains who had kept Greenland connected to the outside world. Meanwhile, European demand for walrus ivory was beginning to collapse. African elephant ivory brought north by Portuguese traders was becoming more readily available. It was easier to obtain, didn't require dangerous voyages into Arctic waters, and came without the risk of losing entire ships to pack ice. The market that had sustained Norse Greenland for centuries was evaporating just when the settlements needed it most. The Norse Greenlanders found themselves trapped in a vicious cycle. The cooling climate made hunting more dangerous and less productive. Reduced ivory production meant fewer ships were willing to make the hazardous journey to Greenland. Fewer ships meant less access to the iron tools, weapons, and grain that the settlements desperately needed. And without these essential supplies, the settlements became even less capable of maintaining their hunting expeditions and ivory production. It was a death spiral, slow and inexorable, playing out over decades in the isolated fjords of southwestern Greenland. But the Norse weren't going down without a fight. Archaeological evidence from the final centuries shows a people who doubled down on the strategies that had sustained them for so long. They focused even more intensively on marine hunting. They developed new techniques for processing seal meat and storing it through the brutal Arctic winters. They adapted their clothing, their tools, even their house construction to deal with the worsening climate. In many ways, they were becoming more Viking than they'd ever been before. More resourceful, more adaptable, more willing to risk everything on dangerous expeditions into unknown waters. But they were doing it in complete isolation, with no safety net, no fallback plan, and no hope of rescue if things went wrong. The Western settlement was the first to fall. By the late 14th century, archaeological evidence suggests it had been completely abandoned. Whether the inhabitants died, fled to the eastern settlement, or simply packed up and sailed away remains a mystery. But the northernmost of Greenland's Norse colonies, the one that had survived for over 3 centuries, simply winked out of existence. The eastern settlement held on longer, clinging to life in the face of impossible odds. But even there, the signs of decline were unmistakable. The population was aging and shrinking. Young women, in particular, seemed to have been leaving or dying in disproportionate numbers, making it impossible for the community to sustain itself through natural reproduction. By 1450, even the eastern settlement had fallen silent. The churches stood empty. The farms lay abandoned. The last of the Norse Greenlanders had either died or departed, leaving behind only ruins and questions that would puzzle scholars for centuries to come. What had happened to Eric the Red's bold experiment? How had a civilization that had thrived for nearly 500 years simply vanished without a trace? The answers would prove as elusive as the aurora borealis, dancing across Greenland's star-filled skies, and the mystery would only deepen as time passed and the ice reclaimed what the Vikings had built. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of voices. It was the kind of quiet that settles over graveyards, thick and oppressive, broken only by the wind whistling through empty doorways. When Hans Egede finally arrived in 1721, he found a landscape that seemed to mock the very idea of human habitation. Stone foundations poked through the permafrost like broken teeth. Church bells lay scattered in the grass, their bronze turned green with age. Wooden beams, once the proud supports of Viking halls, had rotted into piles of soggy fiber. But here's what makes this mystery so haunting. The Norse Greenlanders didn't just pack up and leave forwarding addresses. They vanished so completely that their disappearance defied every pattern of historical abandonment we know. When civilizations collapse, they leave evidence, mass graves from disease, burned buildings from warfare, hastily buried treasure from desperate flight. The Norse left none of these things. Instead, they left something far more puzzling: signs of careful, deliberate preparation. Houses that had been methodically stripped of anything valuable. Churches where precious items had been carefully removed rather than abandoned. Even the graveyards told a strange story. The latest burials showed no signs of mass death, no evidence of plague or starvation or violence. They looked exactly like the graves of people who expected their community to continue long after they were gone. This wasn't the archaeological signature of catastrophe. It was the signature of a people who had time to make choices, to decide what to take and what to leave behind. But if that's true, then where did they go? And why did they leave no record of their departure? The theories that emerged to explain this vanishing act read like a catalog of medieval nightmares. Perhaps the Inuit, the native peoples who had recently arrived in Greenland, had massacred the Norse in a series of coordinated attacks. The sagas spoke of conflicts between the two peoples, battles where Norse steel met Inuit cunning in the eternal struggle for survival in the Arctic. But this theory crumbled under archaeological scrutiny. There were no mass graves filled with Viking bones, no evidence of burned settlements or destroyed churches, no signs that Inuit communities had suddenly acquired large quantities of Norse goods or tools. If genocide had occurred, it had been accomplished with a thoroughness that bordered on the supernatural. Maybe disease had done what warfare couldn't. The Black Death had devastated Europe in the 14th century, reducing entire kingdoms to ghost towns. Iceland had lost 2/3 of its population when plague struck in 1402. Perhaps the same fate had befallen Greenland, with the last survivors sailing away in desperation, carrying the infection with them to their graves in some unknown corner of the North Atlantic. Again, the evidence refused to cooperate. Plague leaves distinctive marks on the archaeological record: mass burial sites, hastily dug graves, signs of social breakdown as communities struggled to dispose of their dead. The Norse Greenlandic sites showed none of these telltale signs. Whatever had happened to Eric the Red's descendants, it wasn't the quick brutality of epidemic disease. Perhaps the answer lay in the ice itself. The Little Ice Age had transformed Greenland from Eric's green valleys into something approaching a frozen hell. Maybe the Norse had simply frozen to death, their bodies preserved somewhere in the permafrost, waiting for modern archaeologists to discover them. But this theory faced the same problem as all the others. The timeline didn't match. The cooling had been gradual, taking place over centuries. The Norse had proven their ability to adapt to changing conditions. They'd survived the transition from farming to hunting. They'd learned to live almost entirely off the sea. Why would they suddenly lose this adaptability just when they needed it most? Recent research has added new pieces to this puzzle, and they're more disturbing than anyone expected. Scientists studying Greenland's glacial cores have discovered evidence of persistent drought during the final centuries of Norse settlement. Not just cold, but dry. the kind of drought that would have devastated hay production, killed livestock, and made the already difficult task of survival nearly impossible. At the same time, geological modeling has revealed something even more shocking. As the Greenland ice sheet advanced during the Little Ice Age, it didn't just make the climate colder. It actually caused local sea levels to rise by as much as 10 feet. Imagine the horror of Norse farmers watching the sea creep steadily inland, swallowing their precious pasture land, flooding their carefully built irrigation channels, turning fertile valleys into salt marshes. This wasn't just climate change. It was environmental catastrophe on a scale that would have challenged even the most adaptable society. The Norse Greenlanders found themselves caught between advancing ice from above and rising seas from below, their narrow band of habitable land shrinking year by year like ice melting in a fire. But even these revelations don't fully explain the mystery. Environmental challenges, no matter how severe, don't usually cause entire populations to vanish without a trace. They cause adaptation, migration, or gradual decline. They don't cause 500 years of human presence to simply evaporate like morning mist. The economic dimension of the collapse adds another layer of complexity to this puzzle. The walrus ivory trade that had sustained Norse Greenland for centuries was facing competition from a source that medieval Europeans could barely have imagined. Portuguese traders were bringing elephant ivory up from Africa, and it was revolutionizing the luxury markets of medieval Europe. African ivory was whiter, easier to carve, and most importantly, it didn't require dangerous voyages into Arctic waters to obtain. Why would a craftsman in Paris or London risk commissioning walrus tusks from Greenland when he could get superior elephant ivory delivered safely to his workshop? The market that had made Norse Greenland wealthy was disappearing just when the settlements needed it most. This created a cascade of economic disasters. Without ivory to trade, Greenland couldn't obtain the iron tools and weapons that were essential for hunting. Without proper tools, hunting became more dangerous and less productive. With reduced hunting success, there was even less ivory to trade. The economic foundation of Norse Greenlandic society was crumbling like ice in spring thaw. The isolation deepened with each passing decade. Ships from Norway and Iceland had once arrived regularly, bringing news, trade goods, and fresh settlers. Now they came rarely, and then not at all. The Norse Greenlanders found themselves cut off from the European world that had given birth to their civilization, alone on the edge of the world with nowhere to go and no one to help them. This isolation had consequences beyond simple economics. The Catholic Church had established a bishopric in Greenland, providing spiritual guidance and maintaining connections to the broader Christian world. But bishops needed to be appointed by authorities in Europe. And as contact with the outside world dwindled, the ecclesiastical structure began to collapse. The last bishop died around 1378, and no replacement ever arrived. Without ordained priests, the Norse Greenlanders couldn't perform the sacraments that were central to medieval Christian life. No baptisms, no marriages, no last rites. The spiritual framework that had helped hold their society together was dissolving along with everything else. Picture the psychological impact of this religious collapse. These were people who had maintained their Christian faith through 5 centuries of Arctic hardship. Their churches had been beacons of civilization in a frozen wilderness, proof that they remained connected to the broader world of Christendom. Now, even that connection was severed, leaving them spiritually as well as physically isolated. Yet, through all of this, archaeological evidence suggests the Norse Greenlanders kept fighting. They didn't simply give up and wait to die. They continued to hunt, to adapt, to innovate. They developed new techniques for preserving meat through the long winters. They modified their clothing to deal with the worsening cold. They even continued to maintain their churches and cemeteries, keeping up the rituals of civilization even as that civilization crumbled around them. The skeletal remains from the final period of Norse settlement tell a story of people under incredible stress. Signs of malnutrition are common, but so are signs of hard physical labor. These weren't people wasting away in passive despair. They were working harder than ever, pushing their bodies to the limit in a desperate struggle for survival. But perhaps most tellingly, the graves from this final period show a disturbing demographic pattern. Young women are dramatically underrepresented in the burial sites. In a healthy population, you'd expect to find roughly equal numbers of male and female remains. Instead, the final Norse Greenlandic graveyards are dominated by older men and children. What happened to the young women? Did they die in disproportionate numbers, perhaps in childbirth, complicated by malnutrition? Or did they leave either through marriage to Inuit communities or as part of desperate attempts to reach Iceland or Norway? Without young women to bear children, the Norse Greenlandic population couldn't sustain itself, no matter how hard the survivors worked. This demographic collapse may hold the key to understanding how an entire civilization could simply vanish. It wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was a slow hemorrhaging of people, particularly the young and fertile, until the remaining population fell below the threshold needed for survival. But even this explanation leaves questions unanswered. If the Norse Greenlanders were gradually abandoning their settlements, where were they going? Ships capable of reaching Iceland or Norway were expensive and difficult to build. The Norse had been cut off from European shipbuilding techniques for decades. How could they have constructed vessels capable of carrying entire communities across the North Atlantic? And if they had somehow managed to build such ships, why is there no record of their arrival anywhere else? Iceland kept detailed records of new arrivals. Norway tracked immigration carefully, yet nowhere in the historical record is there any mention of refugees from Greenland arriving in significant numbers. The mystery deepens when we consider the possibility that the Norse Greenlanders didn't leave at all. What if they're still there, hidden not in space but in time, their descendants scattered among the modern population of Greenland in ways that historians have only recently begun to understand? DNA analysis of modern Greenlanders has revealed traces of European ancestry that predate the arrival of Danish colonists by centuries. These genetic markers tell a story of mixing between Norse settlers and Inuit peoples, a gradual blending of populations that may have been the real fate of Eric the Red's descendants. If this theory is correct, then the Norse Greenlanders didn't vanish at all. They transformed, adopting Inuit survival techniques, intermarrying with Inuit families, and gradually losing their distinct cultural identity while contributing their genes to the broader population of Arctic peoples. This would explain why there are no mass graves, no signs of catastrophic departure, no records of refugees arriving elsewhere. The Norse didn't die out or sail away. They became something else, their Viking heritage diluted and absorbed into the indigenous cultures that were better adapted to survival in the changing Arctic environment. But this theory, compelling as it might be, raises questions of its own. If Norse-Inuit intermarriage was the solution to the demographic crisis, why did the settlements themselves remain empty? Why didn't hybrid communities continue to occupy the carefully built farms and churches that represented centuries of Norse investment in Greenlandic soil? The answer may lie in the fundamental differences between Norse and Inuit survival strategies. The Norse had built a sedentary agricultural society tied to specific locations by their farms, churches, and trading posts. The Inuit, by contrast, were nomadic hunters who moved seasonally to follow game and avoid the worst weather. As conditions in Greenland became more difficult, the Inuit way of life may have proven superior. Flexible, mobile communities could adapt to changing ice conditions and animal migration patterns in ways that fixed settlements simply couldn't match. The Norse descendants who survived may have done so by abandoning not just their buildings, but their entire approach to Arctic living. This cultural transformation would have been gradual, taking place over generations rather than years. Norse farming techniques would have been slowly abandoned as hunting became more important. Norse language would have given way to Inuit dialects better suited to describing Arctic conditions. Norse Christianity would have blended with Inuit spiritual practices, creating hybrid belief systems that helped people make sense of their harsh environment. Eventually, the physical remnants of Norse civilization, the stone churches and turf houses that had once seemed so permanent, would have become irrelevant to people whose lives revolved around seasonal movement and flexible adaptation. The buildings would have been abandoned not in crisis, but in evolution, left behind like snakeskins as their former inhabitants transformed into something entirely new. If this theory is correct, then the mystery of the lost Vikings isn't really a mystery at all. It's a success story, the tale of a people who proved their adaptability by changing so completely that they became invisible to history. Eric the Red's descendants didn't vanish. They survived by becoming indistinguishable from the indigenous peoples who had mastered Arctic living long before the first Viking ship ever reached Greenlandic shores. But even this seemingly satisfying explanation leaves loose threads dangling in the Arctic wind. The transformation theory might explain what happened to the people, but it doesn't fully account for the timing of the abandonment or the complete absence of hybrid communities in the historical record. The truth may be even stranger than any theory we've explored so far. What if the answer lies not in a single cause, but in a perfect storm of catastrophes that struck just when the Norse Greenlanders were most vulnerable? Picture this: a civilization already stretched to its breaking point by climate change, economic collapse, and demographic decline, suddenly facing one final challenge that pushed them over the edge into oblivion. Recent archaeological investigations have uncovered evidence that paints a picture of a community living on borrowed time. The final decades of Norse occupation show signs of desperate improvisation. Tools repaired again and again until they were barely functional, buildings patched with whatever materials could be scavenged. Even the churches, once proud symbols of European civilization in the Arctic, show evidence of makeshift repairs using driftwood and salvaged stone. These weren't the actions of a thriving society. They were the desperate measures of people who knew they were running out of options but refused to give up hope. Every bent nail straightened and reused, every scrap of metal carefully hoarded, every piece of wood too valuable to waste. The Norse Greenlanders were clinging to their way of life with the tenacity of people who had nowhere else to go. But perhaps most haunting of all are the stories that survive in Inuit oral tradition. Tales passed down through generations that speak of encounters with the last Vikings. These aren't the romanticized sagas of European literature. They're matter-of-fact accounts of meetings between two very different peoples, each struggling to survive in an environment that showed mercy to neither. The Inuit stories speak of pale-skinned people who lived in stone houses and kept strange animals. They describe conflicts over hunting grounds, but also moments of cooperation, trade, and even friendship. Some tales hint at intermarriage, at children who belong to both worlds and neither. Others suggest that some Norse learned Inuit survival techniques, adopting kayaks and ice fishing methods that their European ancestors would never have recognized. But these same stories also contain darker elements, references to hunger winters when the stone house people grew thin and desperate, accounts of empty settlements found by Inuit hunters, with doors left open and fires long cold. Tales of ships seen sailing east toward the sunrise, carrying the last of the pale people away from Greenland forever. So there you have it, the chilling tale of an entire civilization that simply melted away like spring ice on a Greenlandic fjord. From Eric the Red's fiery ambition to that final haunting silence that greeted Hans Egede in 1721, we've journeyed through 5 centuries of triumph, adaptation, and ultimately vanishing. Whether the Norse Greenlanders died, fled, or transformed into something unrecognizable, their fate remains one of history's most compelling mysteries. Sweet dreams, and remember that even the mightiest civilizations can disappear without a whisper.